joining us today. We're here to launch the report and discuss some findings from our research titled Qualitative Research with Micro-Entrepreneurs in South Africa's Townships, Factors of Success and Failure of Migrant-owned and South African national-owned businesses in the informal economy. My name is Anthony Kaziboni. I'm a senior researcher at the University of Johannesburg's Center for Social Development in Africa, the CSDA. I'll be chairing this meeting. This year marks a significant milestone for the CSDA. 2 decades of dedicated research. We've spent these 20 years not just existing, but actively driving research that tackles complex social development challenges in South Africa and the Global South. We strive to innovative solutions, test their effectiveness, and develop the next generation of development experts who can analyze evidence and spearhead solutions to social problems. This study wouldn't have been possible without the contributions of many. We are very grateful to the World Bank for commissioning the research funded by Normand. Special thanks to Samantha DeMartino, Gibson Mudiriza, and Wendy Cunningham for their invaluable insights and feedback throughout the project. The research team consisted of talented researchers, Uliso Matiza, Dominique Khlala, Kotha Parker, Noiso Fikani, and Bulelani Masketi. We also extend our gratitude to 3 exceptional sociology honors students who interned at the CSDA, Kiarebetswe Mokele, Nolutando Mavuso, Onwaba Gamlama. We appreciate the network of transcribers who delivered timely and accurate transcripts. A huge thank you goes to Kellen Marks, Palesa Meso, and Beta Mangana for the invaluable administrative support. Their contributions was essential to the project's success. Finally, our deepest gratitude goes to the key informants and micro-entrepreneurs who generously shared their time and insights with us. Their participation was crucial to this study. Let's move on to the exciting part of the presentation. We will start by affording an opportunity to our director, Professor Lauren Graham, who is a development sociologist committed to social justice, focusing on enhancing opportunities for individuals to realize their full capabilities. Her research mainly addresses marginalized groups such as unemployed youth, persons with disabilities, children, and children in adverse conditions. Lauren blends theoretical research with practical solutions to improve social development outcomes. She is a professor here at the University of Johannesburg, an NRF-rated scholar, again, the director of the Center for Social Development in Africa. Additionally, she chairs the International Consortium for Social Development Africa branch. Lauren, the moment is yours.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for the warm welcome. And I just want to ask if all of the attendees, we've got fantastic attendance today, and I can already see from the list of attendees and a number of names that I recognize, people that are very active in the sector. And I think it would be really helpful if you could pop into the chat, if the chat is available to you, or the Q&A, to introduce yourself. Let us know who you are, which organization are you representing, which country are you coming from. It would be really great to see that in the chat and in the Q&A so that we all know who's in the virtual room with us. And then just to say that we will have opportunities for conversation with all of you after the presentation. So if you would like to, as we're presenting, use the Q&A function to pop in your questions, and we will respond to them either during the presentations or in the conversation afterwards. Great, so I will share my screen. And the people who have been leading the research, it was a collaboration between ourselves at the CSDA and Professor Ariane Delanois at the Southern Africa Labour and Development Research Unit at UCT. She is also on the panelists. And just to echo Anthony's point about the input and support from the World Bank team, Gibson, Samantha, and Wendy, I think the constant conversations and reflections were really helpful in shaping the research along the way. So just grateful thanks to the team, also to Anthony and Senzi. Senzi will be presenting a little later for all of their input. So the presentation outline is we're going to have the background and rationale, which I'll speak to, the research question aims and objectives, and the methods. And then I'm going to hand over to Senzelwe, who really drove the project on our side to talk through the findings. And I'll come back to talk about the recommendations. So in terms of why we did this research, we know that, sorry. We know that trade and entrepreneurship in the informal sector is a crucial aspect of the economy in South Africa and many other developing contexts. It provides very important livelihood opportunities for many living in circumstances of poverty. And it is the informal sector often acts as a last mile distributor of goods and services to those living in poverty. But those that work in the sector are often overlooked. And they're often overlooked in policy. They're often dealt with in the people working in the sector, as we'll show in the study, are often if we think about micro enterprise policy, the subset of micro entrepreneurs working in the informal sector is very much overlooked and often actually vilified rather than supported. And in a context of high rates of unemployment in the formal sector, there is increasing emphasis on micro entrepreneurship or entrepreneurship in general. And how can we facilitate growth in entrepreneurship, much of which would occur in the informal sector? And if we are emphasizing growth in this informal sector, in entrepreneurship in the informal sector, then there is the potential to create more vulnerability if appropriate policies and programs are not in place to adequately support and empower entrepreneurs working in this space. And so this prompted an investigation into how best to support micro entrepreneurs operating in the informal sector. The research question was, what factors contribute to success in immigrants and nationals micro-enterprise ownership in South Africa? And what lessons can be drawn to support an increased productive engagement in the informal sector in South Africa's townships? Now, you might wonder why this contrast between immigrants and nationals is that we see in a lot of the research that has been done that immigrant entrepreneurs working in the informal sector are often start up businesses quite quickly, and they also have more success in their businesses. And so we were interested to understand, what do we learn from that can help us to better support this sector? But we also know that both immigrants and nationals run successful businesses, and both immigrants and nationals struggle in the sector. And so it was a comparative study, which I'll get to, where we looked at immigrants and nationals, but also successful entrepreneurs and struggling entrepreneurs. So the objectives were to comparatively assess whether motivations for engaging in micro-entrepreneurship differ between national and immigrant micro-entrepreneurs, but also between successful and struggling entrepreneurs. To look at the business strategies, particularly supply and demand flows, networks, pricing, and investment, the challenges and opportunities that these different groups experience, and how they understand their success and their struggles. So we had a qualitative, comparative, exploratory research design, which allowed us to explore and comparatively assess the motivations, strategies, successes, and challenges of national and immigrant micro-entrepreneurs and of successful and struggling or sustainable and struggling entrepreneurs. The site selection, we conducted the study in 3 townships in 3 different provinces. So in Gauteng, we did the study in Ebony and Ivory Park. In the Northwest Province, we were in Marikana, and in Western Cape, we were in Langa. And the map there shows the locations. The townships we went to were chosen based on concentration of both national and immigrant micro-entrepreneurs, but also very practically where we had established connections for accessing that community. The data collection involved, firstly, in interviews with 12 key informants. These were experts at national and provincial government departments, as well as organizations focusing on micro-entrepreneurship or migration, and international and national NGOs working with micro-entrepreneurs. And we're very grateful. Many of those key informants are actually in the session today, and we're very grateful to them for their time. We then conducted focus group discussions in each of the townships. The plan was to have 4 focus groups, one with successful and, or one each with successful and struggling immigrant micro-entrepreneurs, and one each with successful and struggling national micro-entrepreneurs. What we found was that it was sometimes incredibly difficult to get some of these micro-entrepreneurs into focus groups, particularly for the successful entrepreneurs. And so we did have to switch in some instances to semi-structured interviews. And then we did a round of analysis, and we then conducted some follow-up interviews with the previous focus group or interview participants. The sampling strategy was purposive, and then talking to other entrepreneurs to refer us to other entrepreneurs, so some snowball sampling as well. I'm now going to hand over to Senzi to talk us through the findings.
Thank you, Lauren. Yeah, so I'm going to try and keep it quick and just jump straight into it. There are quite a number of slides to get through. So Lauren did mention that this was a qualitative study, but we did administer a demographic form to our participants. And so the next 5 slides or so will just be sharing some characteristics of interest. And you can see there that just over half of our participants were immigrants, and the remaining should be 35. So we had 35 out of 75 of our participants who were South African, and then 45 who were immigrants. And then when you look, oh, we should, Lauren, we should be showing citizenship.
Yeah,
but that's fine. I'll just speak to that. We also looked at education levels, and it's not in the slide that you can see in front of you, but most of our participants had completed secondary school. When we looked more closely at educational attainment and compared that with, between the survivalists and the sustainable businesses, we did see that there were higher levels of education amongst those running sustainable businesses. And in the slide that you can see that we had slightly more females represented than males in our sample. And then when you look to the right, what was interesting was that amongst the survivalist businesses, females comprised a significant portion. So that kind of suggests to us, at least, in our sample, that women are more likely to operate survivalist businesses. And then when we look at sustainable business owners, we can see there's a prevalence of males, also suggesting to us that males are more likely to run sustainable businesses. Turning to the main business activities, you can see there was quite a large mix of services across the 3 locations, with the majority being takeaways, followed by grocery stores and convenience stores, and then hairdressers and barbers, which make up the kind of beauty salon segment, also were quite prominent there. Yeah, so let's move on to the next slide. We then zoned in on our immigrant participants. And so based on the countries of origin, we see that Zimbabwe was the most common country of origin for immigrants. That was followed by Lesotho and Malawi. The distribution, obviously, of these country of origin responses differs across the different locations. When we look at reasons for migration, we can see that looking for work was most common, followed by seeking a better life and escaping conflict or war. But all these reasons are quite related to one another. And then when we look at local languages spoken by our immigrant participants, you can see there's quite a variety of languages spoken. But interestingly, 40% of the immigrant participants didn't speak any of the South African languages. And the majority of those, of that 40% were sustainable business owners. So that obviously challenges the notion that local language proficiency is essential for immigrant business success. And then lastly, I'm not going to spend time on this slide, but we did explore average monthly revenue as reported by micro entrepreneurs, and you can see which category kind of had the most responses, just telling us that many of the businesses operated in the lower to middle income range. Okay, so when we go to the qualitative findings now, we'll start with micro level or individual level factors, such as agency and their motivations for starting businesses. And we'll also look at their strategies for starting and growing a business. And we can see here that the primary factor that motivated business startup, and this cut across all our entrepreneurs, was unemployment. And this was an extrinsic factor in the sense that this is an external factor that pushes people into entrepreneurship. We also asked about their reasons for, well, we asked about the reasons for starting up a business, and you can see these are the responses that came up. They make reference to unemployment, they make reference to job losses, and they also make references to family and supporting family. For locals, there was a recognition that there weren't jobs in the economy, but you can also see in some of those quotations that there were job losses, so sudden job losses. Whereas with immigrants, there's a sense that when they come to South Africa, they are aware that they might struggle to find employment and decent work, especially when they don't have the correct paperwork. So they experience higher levels of desperation, and in response to this, they intentionally take up opportunities to seek better economic opportunities in the informal sector. So these are all the extrinsic focuses, and the next motivations we'll discuss are intrinsic. These were not pervasive, but we did see them coming up amongst sustainable businesses. And these intrinsic motivations included wanting to leave a legacy for their children, as well as wanting autonomy and flexibility. So while intrinsic motivations were not pervasive, this finding does suggest that they may play a role in business sustainability. You can go to the, okay, yeah. So when we asked, this was also a very interesting finding, we asked all our participants whether they preferred to run their own business or to be formally employed. and almost all responded that they preferred running their own business, even those who had been employed before. And many recognized what they were able to achieve and provide for themselves and their families through their businesses. So you can see in the quotations there, I can buy what I want to eat. My kids are going to creche. Life is normal like other people. We take the kids to school, we buy groceries, we pay our policies. This is the recognition of all the things that they're able to achieve while running their own business. Now we'll move on to strategies for business startup. So this was another key aspect of agency that we explored beyond motivations. And the focus here is on the individual level strategies that were used to start up and then to grow their businesses. And the emphasis here was on resourcefulness. So resourcefulness involved identifying existing assets. So they relied on their own assets as well as assets of family members and friends. So for example, if a family member had a house, they would use that as premises for operating the business. They also started small. So there are several stories in the study of participants using very small amounts of money to get their businesses started. But in that second, and that quote there under starting small, you can also see levels of patience, right, in growing that money over time to grow the business. They also leveraged existing skills and knowledge. Some were employed previously, but also they recognized skills that they had within themselves. And if they didn't have those skills, they would ask friends or people around them to teach them skills. So that just shows that there was a high level of engagement in businesses that didn't require high levels of skills. And then when we look at the strategies for business growth, there was a big emphasis here on research. So researching your products, researching the services, researching what would keep your customers happy, and research that went into strategizing around how to price your items. What this research helped them to do was to decide on the best products and services to offer, as well as to gain and adapt to customers' feedback. And it also helped them to adapt their pricing. So you can see in the various quotations here, the different ways that entrepreneurs went about doing this research. I looked at the children. What do they go buy when I do not open? Also looked at what their customers were buying from other people's stores. And then they would stock more of those items. The second quotation there says, I test the market. And you can see in the last quotation, someone who was looking into starting a kota business would go to different businesses that already existed, asking for prices, asking to see their menus. And this would also help inform how to, check for quality or how to know which products to buy and kind of how to price those. So in the previous slide, all those points connect to being customer-centric. And this was the most embedded strategy that entrepreneurs used. And so what they did is they would operate outside of usual working hours. They would go the extra mile for their clients. So providing services at very early hours when their customers are available, locating the business in strategic areas like clinics or near busy transport nodes, and encouraging word-of-mouth referrals through offering discounts. And these were just some of the ways that they maintained and grew their customer base. We do see some differences in these strategies amongst sustainable business owners. So what we're seeing among sustainable business owners is greater diversity in their product offering. And so, for example, an entrepreneur would move from selling fruit to selling smoothies. Other examples that we saw in the study was adding different kind of product lines, such as herbal medicines. And that was just the different ways that they tried to diversify from other shops and from other business owners. They were also more financially sophisticated in how they made decisions about pricing and discounts. So oftentimes they would mention percentages and markups, and this allowed them to offer discounts. They were also more strategic about how they managed their finances and made decisions around income that would be allocated towards their business and be reinvested into the business versus using this income for personal needs. And you can see in the quotation there, whenever I get something, no matter how small it is, I have to keep it so that I can manage to pay rent and other expenses. I track my monthly profit diligently. It's not in the slide, but immigrant entrepreneurs were particularly good at making these sacrifices, these kind of personal needs sacrifices in order to invest more into their businesses. Okay, so we're now going to look at factors kind of external to the individual, such as family, friends, and community that were in the entrepreneur's surrounding context that supported and or constrained business startup and growth. And the main finding here, when we look at external factors of enablement, was that entrepreneurs emphasize their own agency, their resilience, their perseverance, and their problem-solving skills. So the emphasis here was on their personal actions and decision-making rather than how they have been supported. However, where there was support that they did receive, this mostly came from their social networks. And this included other business owners, family, and friends. So in terms of the support received from other business owners, entrepreneurs get advice about what and where to stock. So you can see in the quotations below, this asking of people who are already in business where they buy their stock, and being guided and referred and led to places of stocking. Next slide. And then in terms of the ways that family members and friends enabled business startup, there were some instances where there was encouragement to start businesses from neighbors or from relatives or friends. That second quotation, my friend said, you don't have an income, you can start something small like a business. He had a friend in Wonderkop and he introduced me to this other lady who had a chicken business. So in some instances, there are direct referrals or ideas that are shared and encouragement to start businesses. In other instances, family members provide assets for business startup or they provide human resource capacity. So helping in the shop, helping with running errands and the like. And then lastly, having a family history of entrepreneurship also supported this idea to start a business and also supported skills development. So we saw this for some of the entrepreneurs. When we look at the differences or differentiators, we see that social networks are leveraged slightly differently for sustainable businesses. There's more evidence here of business partnership with friends, with family members, and these partnerships allow them to combine their income, so to pool resources together, to discuss business strategies and ideas, to have additional human resources, and to combine their skills. So we can see in these quotes, you know, these are just different examples of how they leverage these social networks to join savings clubs, to buy in bulk. We can see one of the participants were able to acquire an asset for her business. And not in the slide, but there was also one example of a business owner who pulled together with their friends a grant. So the 350 Rand grant was pulled together as well to start their business. Next slide. So this slide talks to how support networks operated differently for immigrants. We saw here that local perceptions of immigrants are that they are, on the balance, more collaborative in their approach to business. And this was not, it's not to say that immigrants are a homogenous group. They were very, I don't know, detailed in their explanations of which nationalities display these this kind of strong spirit of collectivism and support for one another. And other immigrant groups were able to confirm this as well. So there is evidence suggesting that there is more of a willingness to loan stock to one another. There's more of a willingness to pool resources, to purchase stock, to provide advice amongst certain nationalities. For Ethiopians in particular, and we did have two entrepreneurs who were from Ethiopia, there were more organized networks of support that we saw. And the way that this would work was explained to us. Someone who would be coming to South Africa would be connected with a fellow Ethiopian business owner and would work under their business for some years. And in that way, they would be, you know, kind of inducted into business practices. When we look at the constraints, the external constraints to business startup and growth, we've categorized these into 4 groups. So the first being just a general lack of support for business startup and growth from government and other stakeholders. The experiences of crime and corruption. The third one being business related and sort of operational risks. The fourth being personal or psychosocial factors. And that included things like mindset as being constraints to business startup. And so looking at the first one there, the lack of support for business startup and growth, there was just a general sense from entrepreneurs that there's very limited support for business startup and growth from government, but also from civil society and the private sector. Even when there was mention of support, so you can see in the second quotation there, there's mention of the CETAs. Even when there is mention of support available, generally when we look at you know, all our interviews, the awareness of support was very limited. And there were some reasons that were speculated for this. So corruption and nepotism being one, limiting access to support by insisting on business registration were some of the ways that entrepreneurs felt they were locked out of opportunities. There was also mention of administrative inefficiencies and other selection criteria that locked entrepreneurs out of support and opportunities. And then a targeting by police who confiscated their goods or asked for bribes. So the second grouping of constraints here was crime and being targeted by police. In townships, we did see that this created a lot of insecurity for micro entrepreneurs, and they were not only targeted by criminals, but they were also targeted by the police for bribes. And this was more prevalent amongst immigrants, but also participants who were based in Langa Township and Marikana in the northwest, those areas seemed to have particularly high levels of crime. And then the third grouping of constraints there was around business-related risks and operational challenges. We see that micro-entrepreneurs face competition, not only by, from direct competitors who are selling the same goods and services, but they're also facing competition from formal businesses who more and more have moved into township communities. And they're also facing competition from new entrants into the sector. So when people lose their jobs, they do tend to look at the informal sector for opportunities. The other thing that was a big constraint was wastage and losses of stock, especially for those selling perishables, but even those who, for example, offered tailoring services. They would have customers not paying even after outfits have been made. And in some instances, wastage and loss occurred because of equipment breaking down or needing maintenance. And sometimes these wastages were as a result of infrastructural challenges, such as water and electricity shortages. The third kind of big business-related risk was around difficulties with cash flow to purchase stock. But not only to purchase stock, but there were also shortages in cash flow to pay for rent or to pay their assistants. So these were just, some of the business-related challenges that they experienced. And then this last one, psychosocial factors. This one was particularly prevalent or important for local entrepreneurs. When we asked our participants why they don't engage in entrepreneurship, and this was both to locals and immigrants, they did share their perceptions with us, and some of those were around fear of failure, that South Africans tend to be risk averse. And the other thing that came up was pride related to the stigma of working in the informal sector. So there's a lot here around perceptions and kind of how South Africans view entrepreneurship in the informal sector. And then jealousy and belief systems also emerged. And the general belief here is that South Africans operate individualistically, are jealous of one another, and are not helpful towards one another when they're in business. And then we saw also cultural belief systems about luck and witchcraft being reported in Marikana as a constraint to business startup and growth. Okay, so turning to the macro level enablers of business startup and growth, as well as macro level constraints. We look now at the policy landscape and also at kind of the programmatic level of what micro entrepreneurs identified at that level. So none of the entrepreneurs identified enablers at the macro level. There were very few factors here that they saw as enablers of business growth. And you can see here, one of the key informants that we spoke to mentioned a little bit about this disconnect, this sort of lack of policy coherence and disconnect between policies and the way that they're implemented on the ground. So I'm just going to read bits of that quotation. There's varying understanding of policies and bylaws. One day we are interpreting that you are not allowed to function on this street corner. The next day, another policeman says it's okay. Thus, there is not a uniform understanding of some of the laws pertaining to migrants and refugees, not just entrepreneurs on the whole. So you can see how there's the sense that there is a disconnect between policies that are written and the way that they're implemented. But on the kind of positive end of things, we did speak to a number of key informants who also mentioned that there were training programs available for micro entrepreneurs. They also highlight new approaches to policy, so being more developmental rather than punitive. And this interview revealed an understanding of the important role that micro entrepreneurs play, and this willingness to support them. However, we are seeing that registration was either a prerequisite or registration was an outcome of training. So there's this emphasis on formalizing those who are in the informal sector, and that kind of being a prerequisite to receiving support. The constraints, so we've just spoken about perceived enablers at the macro level. And the constraints also here have to do with the policy landscape as well as the lack of government support. So at a policy level, what we're seeing is that policy documents are not distinguishing micro entrepreneurs as a discrete type of business that requires different forms of support. And while there is this rhetoric of wanting to support small businesses, that doesn't quite correspond to bylaws, which are by and large still quite harsh in the way that they're implemented. And then when we speak about lack of government support for business inputs, for startup and growth, a lot of the responses here from the key informants and from micro entrepreneurs themselves were around this lack of access to funding, this limited availability of or awareness of training and workshops, the lack of support with business registration and trading permits, as well as this criteria being really stringent and exclusionary. So both locals and immigrants at various stages of business success felt that there was this lack of government assistance, which made sustaining and growing their businesses challenging. But there was also this sense that corruption and people not doing their jobs, as well as xenophobic attitudes, these were mentioned as some of the reasons why the support is not being received, along with the stringent selection criteria. So I'll just read a segment of this quotation, which says, "Just because of corruption, we cannot get these things." In the beginning of this quotation, the entrepreneur recognizes that we have all of this support in South Africa, but these are some of the issues that are, kind of taking away from positive gains. And the second quotation there is, "If you are not giving bribes, they cannot send, or they can send you like a whole year going in and out of Home Affairs, trying to get papers." So this was the sense that there's almost an intentional, or there's a xenophobic attitude within some of these government departments that make these processes extremely hard for immigrants, even when they are trying to get their documents in order. And then this emphasis on registration to access support is something that came up. Although registration amongst the micro entrepreneurs we interviewed was viewed with mixed feelings. On the one hand, there's this feeling that they will not get anything in return for registering. There's a sense that they have managed to start their businesses, and that there was no support when they started these businesses. So why should they register. But on the other hand, there's the sense especially from locals, that registering gives you recognition as a business owner, that it protects you against risks in times of crisis, and that it gives you access to more opportunities and bigger jobs. So even though our micro entrepreneurs were operating small businesses, a lot of them were struggling businesses, there were quite a few locals who did attempt to register their businesses at one point or another. Moving on to support required. So I think given all the constraints that we've just mentioned, this section reports on micro entrepreneurs' feedback on existing support received to start or sustain a business, or support that they felt they needed. And the overarching finding here about what support is needed is around social networks. So there's an emphasis there on fostering a culture of collectivism. So local entrepreneurs really valued that sense of collectivism that they felt was present amongst immigrant traders. You can see in this quotation that a local survivalist business owner is saying there, I need support because support is the one thing I do not have. I'm standing alone in the business. So I need someone who can assist me. So there's this real sense that those who did not receive business support, those who did not have social networks that they could leverage, they really acknowledged needing this kind of support. And the key informants, as well as the micro entrepreneurs we interviewed, felt that collaboration would help businesses to grow, but they recognize that there's a need to be organized. So there's a need for organizations to convene this collectivism, and that a mindset of collaboration really does need to be fostered. The other big theme that came up under support required was around skills training. So business skills was something they felt was an important mechanism that they needed. And they were particularly interested in support for financial management to support business growth rather than startup. I think we've seen in previous slides how their motivations, their agency, their decision-making around which products to stock, and their use of small amounts of money to start their businesses proves to us that the ability to start a business wasn't their major concern, but more so around support to grow their businesses. Interestingly, financial support was mentioned, but not in isolation of skills training. So there was the sense that, you know, you could be given money through funding or whatnot, but that alone would not be enough, right? So funding alone would be insufficient. And the quotation below says, yes, not just money, because with money, they give you money. Like for me, it's a business, it's an internet cafe, and I can buy expensive machines, but no one comes. So there's a real need for education and training around how to run a business and how to grow a business. And then there were strong calls for support for business registration, despite these, you know, varying views about the value of registration. But over and above, registration was seen as being a requirement for accessing support, as well as for bringing in other opportunities and recognition. They did feel that the process was confusing. So knowledge and access to information was missing for our participants. I think I will end it there. Lauren, I'll hand over to you to talk through some of the recommendations.
Thank you, Senzi. Yeah, so drawing on all of those findings, we look at the recommendations at those same three levels, the macro level recommendations, meso level recommendations, and micro level recommendations. And at the macro level, it really is about policy shift and shifts in the discourse about firstly entrepreneurship, but particularly entrepreneurship in the informal sector. So there's a strong need to recognize micro-entrepreneurship's economic and social value in the informal sector and to create a framework to support it. So if I just want to give a little bit more detail about that finding around the policy landscape and the fact that micro-entrepreneurship is defined in the small business or SMME policy support strategies. But their micro-entrepreneurship is defined as any business that's under 5 million Rand in turnover and less than 10 employees. And we know that these micro-entrepreneurs that we were focusing on, which is a large proportion of entrepreneurs, are really operating on the margins of that, nowhere near 5 million Rand in turnover. And so within that micro-entrepreneurship frame, we need to disaggregate that. To say there's this group of micro-entrepreneurs that are really operating on the margins and to recognize the value and the economic and social value that they deliver, to better define that particular group, recognize that particular group in small business development policies. And so that we can then say, differentiate different kinds of support that they may need. That somebody who runs a much more established small business with a turnover of less than 5 million might not need to access. When we're looking at policy development and strategy development, both at national and provincial or local levels, there's a real need, and many of the entrepreneurs actually expressed this, as did key informants, to consult with informal sector entrepreneurs. To date, policy development has largely overlooked this important constituent. There hasn't been consultation, often because this is a less organized grouping. And that means that their experiences and ideas are absent in policy thinking. And they're best placed to identify the kinds of support they require to enable business startup and growth. And then this point about policy coherence. And this is really about the policy coherence between different departments. So for instance, looking at the Department of Small Business Development playing much more of a coordination role to review different policies to see how they constrain or enable entrepreneurship in the sector. But also then looking from national to local level. So if we at the national level are talking about small business development and promoting entrepreneurship in the informal economy, as we have seen in State of the Nation addresses, for instance, what does that mean at the local level in terms of bylaws? And those bylaws being particularly restrictive to that kind of economic growth. There also needs to be consideration paid to the requirements for registration. So a question around, is registration always necessary? We heard that there's this constant experience of registration being a barrier to accessing different kinds of support. And there needs to really be a balance. There are very real reasons why registration might be necessary, and in other contexts why it might not. So this blanket requirement for registration needs to be considered. And where it is necessary, then there needs to be an emphasis on making those registration processes low cost and easy to access. At the moment, they're experienced as very bureaucratic and costly. And what is the value in registering? What does the entrepreneur get access to that would make registering worth the time taken out of their business and the costs involved? And then there's this need to shift perceptions, the public discourse about the benefits of working in the informal sector. And some of this research that we've done, but research that other people have done, really shows the value of the work that entrepreneurs do in the sector, and that can inform awareness campaigns by government and civil society. At the meso level, there were a lot of calls for this collectivism, and so some of the recommendations that emerge are around thinking around communal approaches to stocking, managing infrastructure risks, accessing different kinds of equipment, providing advice and support to one another. But these kinds of communal approaches really do need to be driven. And so there are opportunities here for civil society to promote collective approaches and possibilities for formal, informal trader associations. So formalizing these kinds of associations for informal traders. And there are examples of that both in South Africa and elsewhere. And then direct support programs for entrepreneurs need to provide financial and non-financial support. So this emphasis, I think a lot of entrepreneurship support focuses on financial, so it's either loans or grants, but actually the non-financial support, skills training, financial management around growth strategies is absolutely crucial. For new entrepreneurs, support programs could focus on asset-based thinking, focusing on the individual household and community assets that are available to be leveraged for building one's own business. And support for existing micro-entrepreneurs really then needs to focus on those growth strategies. But entrepreneurs need to be able to access them quite easily without taking long periods of time out of their businesses. So they could be shorter, really focused on particular targeted skills that they're interested in rather than a whole long entrepreneurship training program. And there are, I think, opportunities for digital mechanisms to support that kind of training. And then where financial support is a requirement, there might be opportunities to promote stokvels and other forms of communal savings. We did see that sustainable entrepreneurs were leveraging those kinds of more informal financial investment strategies. And then it needs to reduce barriers to entry, particularly around registration, but also the time taken off from running businesses. And then at the micro level, we can really learn from what micro entrepreneurs are already doing in order to design programs. So really that focus on their resourcefulness, starting small, their resilience, the asset-based thinking are all elements that we can learn from to inform programmatic development. And then there needs to be some support to shift perceptions of working in the informal sector and that fear of failure. There's possibilities to tell the success stories, and there were many in this study and in many other studies, to tell the success stories through advocacy campaigns and to shift the mindsets of informal sector entrepreneurs once they start a business from thinking about the business as a stopgap measure to thinking of it as a desirable pathway to creating income. And if we can support the sector at the meso level and the macro level, there's much more opportunity to really demonstrate that this is a desirable pathway to creating income. And then training and mentorship can focus on some of those mindset shifts that we picked up in the study. And we'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much to our speakers for very interesting presentation. I would like to formally acknowledge Luana Yone, who's here representing the ambassador of Colombia to South Africa. Thank you for joining us. And I would also like to acknowledge colleagues from this university. I see that people from UCT, WITS, Great Zimbabwe, the National University of Lesotho, UKZN, UNISA, University of Lubumbashi in the DRC, students, academics, and researchers. We also have government representation, people from legislature, social workers, colleagues from Stats SA, the Department of Social Development, South African Revenue Services, the Department of Science and Innovation. Thank you for coming. Office of the Military Ombuds. Thank you. CSOs are represented as well. APCOF, Somali Association of South Africa, Kids Haven in Benoni. Yes, we omitted to, I omitted to introduce Senz. Senz, I'll apologize for that. It's the lady who spoke last, well, in between Lauren's discussion. Senz was very instrumental in this study. Without Senz's effort, it wouldn't have happened. But who is she? Senzelo Mthembu is a researcher here at the Center for Social Development. She holds a BA in politics, philosophy, and economics, and an honors degree in philosophy from the University of Johannesburg, and a master's in philosophy from Wits. She has worked on projects related to youth employability, education interventions, and school-to-work transitions. In 2019, she joined a network exploring non-formal arts-based education in fragile contexts. Her work focuses on monitoring and evaluation, research and innovation, as well as sustainable development for youth and disadvantaged communities. Again, Senz led this project. Our discussant, Wendy, please get ready, is Wendy Cunningham. She is a lead economist in the World Bank's Human Capital Project. During her 20 years at the World Bank, Wendy has carried out research and provided operational support on issues related to jobs, labor markets, socio-emotional skills, youth development, and gender in Africa, East Asia, and Pacific, as well as Latin America and Caribbean regions. Wendy has a PhD in labor economics from the University of Illinois and publishes in economics, education, and psychology journals. Wendy, the moment is yours.
Thank you, Anthony, and hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to be here. And as Anthony mentioned, I am an economist at the World Bank, and I had the great pleasure over the past 6 months to work with Anthony and Lauren and Senz and the amazing team that put this study together. So as an economist who works in international development, I thought that my 10 minutes as a discussant might be useful in reflecting on how this study that Lauren and Senz just presented, how that informs the global debate that we economists who work in international development have been having on informal micro-entrepreneurship. As Anthony mentioned, I've worked in many regions of the world, and so I think that I can also bring that aspect of what does informal micro-entrepreneurship look like in other parts of the world relative to South Africa, and maybe put on the table some areas for discussion. So I will be one of those annoying presenters who has her own PowerPoint. But so I hope that you will indulge me. I think it's probably more efficient if I share a PowerPoint rather than trying to act out graphs and such. So I just wanted to start with why, again, as an economist who has looked at informality in a lot of different countries, why South Africa is so fascinating. And South Africa has an unusual relationship with informal employment. And so this slide has two parts to it, two sets of data that I wanted to share. The table on the left is from a paper by Haroon Borat, who he prepared it in 2022. Haroon is an economist at UCT, for those of you who don't know him. And what Haroon did is he wanted to try to understand what is the distribution of people in the labor force across being wage employed, being informally employed, and being unemployed. And so what Haroon did was he looked at the share of the labor force in upper middle income countries that fall into each of these three categories, and the share of South Africans that fall into each of these three categories. And what he found is that for wage employment, about half of the labor force in upper middle income countries and about half of the labor force in South Africa are wage employees. Okay. Where it becomes really interesting is looking at the next two columns. So if he looks at the share of the labor force that's informally employed, he found that for upper middle income countries, it's about 45% of the labor force, whereas in South Africa, it's only about 16% of the labor force. And so it was like, okay, well, let's look at the last column and what's happening in the last column. And what he calculated is that upper middle income countries that have about 10% unemployment of the labor force, whereas South Africa, it's about 34%. And so what his conclusion is, which is the title of this table, is that South Africa seems to be trading off unemployment for informal employment. So informal employment is low, but unemployment is quite high in South Africa, and it's the opposite in upper middle income countries. So the second piece of information I wanted to share with you is the very messy graph on the right-hand side. And what this graph is showing is it is showing the on the x-axis, so it is level of development, GDP per capita, and the right axis is the percentage of the labor force that's in the informal sector. So these are countries that are middle income countries and high income countries. The box, that orange box, is basically middle income countries. And so if we just look within that orange box, all these different countries that are listed there, we find that South Africa is actually very low down in that box. It's not kind of up at the top. IDN is Indonesia, which is kind of the highest informality of middle income countries. South Africa is rather low down in that box, which is saying that given its level of development, the share of people who work in the informal sector is rather low. And I think that I see that we have people from many other countries who are online other than South Africa. And I think that we can all speak to observing very dynamic, very large dynamic informal sectors in Nairobi or in Accra or in Bangkok or in Bogota. And we're just not seeing that as much in South Africa. So that for me is very curious. And I thought, okay, what's going on here? So when we had this opportunity to work with Lauren and Anthony and Sen's and team, that was what was kind of in the back of my mind as an outsider coming in. So what I'd like to spend my next 8 minutes doing is highlighting some of the findings of the research that Lauren and Sen's just presented, and putting that next to kind of the conventional wisdom by economists who work in development, and doing that comparison. So there are four paper findings I wanted to share with this group. So first of all, there's a view that informal workers are just queuing for formal sector jobs. This is kind of the conventional wisdom in economics, and particularly those of us who work in development. But there are actually two schools of thought. So the school of thought that's the most prominent is this exclusion school. And what the exclusion school basically argues is that workers are forced into informality while waiting for a formal sector job to open up. So this theory was put forth in 1970, actually, by two economists, Harris and Tadaro. And it's actually still quite prominent. The World Bank, in fact, published a report last year that really argued in favor of the exclusion school. There's another school of thought, though, that we call the exit school, which say that people select into informality as a welfare maximizing choice. So they look around and they say, given my options, being an informal micro-entrepreneur is better than my alternative of being a wage worker or unpaid worker. And that the exit school kind of became more visible. Maloney 2004 had a paper, followed by a rather substantial report by Perry et al. In 2007. So this paper, so I had those two ideas in mind, these two schools, and then in working through this paper, what I learned is that this paper supports both schools, but with a time dimension. And so this quote I took out of the previous version of the PowerPoint that Lauren and Sens gave, but the quote, the paper's conclusion is, one of the paper's conclusions is, most entrepreneurs identify push factors for becoming an entrepreneur, but once running their own business, both survivalists and sustainable entrepreneurs prefer to remain self-employed. I acknowledge that there is what we call a selection bias, meaning that the people who were interviewed are only people who are existing entrepreneurs. We're not interviewing the team did not interview those who had been entrepreneurs and left. So we acknowledge that. But even amongst those who are entrepreneurs, what we were hearing is that wasn't so happy about going into it, but once I'm here, it's actually working out for me. Okay. So that challenges this conventional wisdom. That's the title of this slide. So the second kind of conventional wisdom is successful micro-entrepreneurship is all about the money. And again, I want to share two schools of thought, or two approaches or ideas that people in my tribe have been thinking about. So the assets approach is that the main constraint to successful micro-entrepreneurship is access to finance, and thus capital inputs like machines or product, as well as skills. Skills is an asset. And I didn't provide a citation here because this is what most of the literature and most of the support that international development and the international development community offers. There's another kind of very small addendum to this assets approach, which is I call introducing A. And what A is it's entrepreneurship. It's a symbol that we use when we write our mathematical equations when we want to indicate entrepreneurship. So introducing this concept of A, and basically that entrepreneurial ability is key to successful entrepreneurship. So this is a theory that comes from way back in 1978, but it's been brought into this informal micro-entrepreneurship in middle income and low income countries more recently. And here's a paper by David McKinsey in 2021 highlights this. So okay, taking those two thoughts, what did I learn from the work that the paper that Lauren and Sins just presented. So what their work, the paper it supports A very heavily, and that A is important to complement assets. So they're saying, yes, we're seeing both the assets approach, but this A is super important. So a couple of quotes that came out of their earlier presentation. First of all, entrepreneurs typically emphasize their own agency, resilience, perseverance, problem-solving skills, and explaining their success. Those abilities, resilience, perseverance, etc., underpin this entrepreneurship concept. And then the second quote says, yes, not just money, because they give you money. Like for me, the respondent, it's an internet cafe and I can buy expensive machines, but no one comes. No customer comes in. And that's it. Without the knowledge of how to run a business, it's useless having material. So I think for those of us who work on programming and policy, that's a really important lesson for us to take forward. Okay, the third kind of conventional wisdom, government support informal micro-entrepreneurs. And the international literature finds that there are country-specific programs. Bosseroy et al., it's just an example of something in Niger, but there's a lot of international literature of country support. Though most support that policymakers give is to formalize entrepreneurs or to work with formal sector entrepreneurs. And this is a paper on Sorge and you in 2022. Again, they're from the World Bank, but there seems to be this idea, just formalize and everything will be fine. For South Africa, a paper that the World Bank prepared a couple of years ago looked at active labor market programs that are offered at the national level in South Africa. And about 1/3 of the programs in that 1/3 of the programs in that database was for entrepreneurs. But when we looked a little bit more closely, the eligibility requirements in order to engage in those programs were such that the programs were out of reach for informal micro-entrepreneurs or the types of people who would become informal micro-entrepreneurs. So one of the conclusions that I learned from this paper, and I'm paraphrasing here, not only does government and NGOs or the private sector not support informal micro-enterprises operating in townships, it actively undermines them. And that last part was a huge blow to me, that government policy is actually undermining this source of economic activity that is so important for the more excluded of the economy. And then the fourth and final kind of conventional wisdom that this paper questioned is informal micro-enterprises are survivalist, not growth-oriented. And so again, there's a couple of views. One view is that the growth-oriented view, where a minority of informal firms want to and are destined to grow, while most, the survivalists, are not. And this is a paper written by Grimm and some co-authors. I think it was 2012, I guessed at that date, maybe 2014. But then there's also this continuum view that informal firms fall along a continuum, all want higher profits, only some want to expand operations. This is a paper, 1999, shows how long I've been working on this topic. So this paper that Lauren and Sens led finds that survival and sustainable entrepreneurs have similar behaviors, with the latter, the sustainables, having resources to go a bit further. And so paraphrasing from their work, all entrepreneurs who they talk to, whether survivalists or sustainable, whether migrants or locals, they all engage in market research into pricing and products. They all engage in customer satisfaction strategies, innovation in sourcing, quality versus price trade-offs, product diversification, et cetera, et cetera. And so we do find that they do find that even kind of those so-called survivalist entrepreneurs do wish to do better and do more. And we see them through the work that Lauren and Sens presented. We see them developing and growing their businesses, even though they're survivalists. So I just wanted to take a final word on policy and point out that there are very well-established evidence-based interventions that address many of the facets that Lauren and Sens pointed out in their presentation, many of the facets that are important for informal micro-entrepreneurs to set up shop and to be successful. And so what these interventions look like on the left with the little arrows, they're basically a sequenced package of support to build networks, entrepreneurial ability, business skills, and provide financing. They tend to be about 1 to 3 year programs. They cost anywhere from $83 to $1,200. This is US dollars, I'm sorry, US per beneficiary. On the right is a picture of one of the programs that, how it rolled out over an 18-month period, group formation and coaching, so networks and mentoring that Lauren mentioned in the beginning, community savings that particularly our migrants in our study pointed out, et cetera, kind of working its way down the line of providing many of these services. To date, this model is operating in more than 90 countries in some of the most difficult conditions that you can imagine. This picture on the right is actually the program for women living in rural Niger. And so that's a tough economy, that's a tough market. And it's been successful in showing impact on income, consumption, savings, employment, women's empowerment, and a lot of other results. And these kinds of impacts have been found across the world. So with that, I will end my intervention. I hope that I put some ideas on the table that will foster our conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Time is not on our side, so I won't also get into the nuances of your argument, but allow the people who've joined us to come through. Please show by raising your hand if you have any questions. I'll take the first one, which is Professor Lauren Landau. Prof, you can mute and ask a question.
Right, thank you very much. I've just written it in the Q&A as well. But all of this is really valuable, and I think it's important, especially if we can get over the kind of policy biases around the informal sector that you've mentioned. What I haven't heard a lot about is the kind of migration story, not just, there's a lot of differentiation, immigrants do this, others do that, but about how both South African and international migrants use the informal sector as gateways to the city, or how remittances work to sustain businesses or to drain them. So I was just wondering if we could hear a little bit more about how you see kind of translocal social processes or economic processes feed into the success, failure, or effects of these micro enterprises. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. And then our next speaker, your name is a tongue twister for me. Please unmute, and then you can introduce yourself.
I'm not sure if I'm the one you are referring to.
How do you pronounce your name?
Mohammed. My name is Abdikadir Mohammed.
Abdikadir. All right.
Thank you for the opportunity. You can call my surname. If my name is difficult for you, probably it will be another day for me to ask you to pronounce it well. Thank you. I have got 3 questions and 1 comment. I will do them all in one box. I will make it very quick. I would like to know what has influenced the researchers to choose specific nationalities when it comes to the migrant population. We all know there was a lot of debates around the influence of Somali spaza shop owners in the townships for a long time in South Africa. However, it seems that they were excluded from this research. I would like to know why. The other question, basing your findings on only 2 people from a country can be very problematic. And I heard the second presenter, I think her name was Zenzile, had her saying that they spoke to two Ethiopians when she was talking about how migrants help each other. And I had her also talking about how that network works. So I don't understand how you can base your findings on speaking to only two Ethiopians. The other question I have is the issue of language barrier. I know majority of migrants, specifically not from SADC, but even some from SADC, although most of your research was about SADC countries, except I think Ethiopia and maybe Rwanda. There's an issue of language barrier. Let me just take the Ethiopian nationals who have participated in this research. Have you used interpreters or were they English speaking themselves? The comment I want to make is on the presentation of Dr. Wendy. And I would like to agree the point she was putting in her presentation. I don't know the source of that, where there is this point that says government and some NGOs actively undermine informal micro enterprises operating in townships. I would like to little bit rephrase it and say government and big retailers, probably Pick and Pay and ShopRite and others, undermine informal micro entrepreneurs operating in townships. And thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll stop you there.
Thank you.
Lauren, since here are the questions, I'll also chip in. So the migrant story, South Africa and immigrants, the use of remittances and translocal economic processes. Then we just need to discuss the sampling strategy, issues around language and generalizing based on the discussion with two people. Lauren, go for it. I'll also chip in at the end.
Yeah. So, Prof. Landau, I think your research has shown a lot about those translocal mechanisms, and I would definitely defer to you on the expertise there. What we did see in this study was certainly how immigrant traders or immigrant entrepreneurs were bringing in items from their home countries, but also were, for instance, those that were working in the food sector were cooking food that would appeal to other people from their home countries. I didn't, and Senzi, you'll have to come in here because you were closer to the data, but certainly when I was looking at the analysis, I didn't pick up on remittances, which is interesting because that is something that has come up in previous research as an important support mechanism enabler. We didn't pick that up particularly. And then, yeah, I think those are the kind of like local or translocal factors that I saw in the data, and I'll defer to Senzi to see if there was anything else that came up. In terms of the sampling strategy, so our sampling strategy was to look for within each township to recruit immigrant successful or sustainable businesses and immigrant survivalist businesses, and the same for local. We didn't have a target of the spread of countries of origin. As you can imagine, if you're already cutting a qualitative sample by successful, survivalist, immigrant, local, you're also looking for some spread in gender. It becomes very difficult then to make sure you're also got country coverage, because then you're really getting a very small subset of each. And so the purpose was not to then look at, are there differences in terms of country origin? The comparators were successful versus sustainable and immigrant versus local. The example, and so we do have Somalis in entrepreneurs in the sample, primarily in the Langa sample, if I'm not mistaken, and Senzi can clarify that. And the example that Senzi was giving was really one example, and there are several in the report. She pulled out one example, the Ethiopian example, as illustrative in the presentation, but there are other examples in the report. In terms of language barriers, so in our data collection team, we had quite a range of languages that were covered in the team, but there were, of course, exclusions. So we didn't, for instance, have somebody on the team who spoke Arabic, and so there were definitely language barriers, and those are covered in the report in terms of limitations. Yeah, Senzi, I'll hand over to you.
No, thank you for the comments, Abdi. And I think in the report there will be a lot more nuance around what we shared in the presentation. The other thing is we did not have an interpreter, so these are definitely some of the limitations. The language barriers, within the team, but we did have a postdoc, an Ethiopian, no, I think he's Eritrean, postdoc, listen to the interview and, provide us with a bit more clarity to ensure that our interpretations were correct of what our participants were saying. Then between the two Ethiopian participants we did speak to, again, this is not going to be in the presentation. There were differences in experiences. Again, those nuances weren't really brought out in the presentation. And the point we were making there was the kind of support or evidence, one example of evidence that supports these perceptions that locals and other groups of immigrants had towards some of these groupings of nationalities. So again, a lot of it is from the perspective of informal traders themselves and micro-entrepreneurs. And a lot of it was perception-based because we couldn't get Somalians and Pakistani nationals and more Ethiopians represented in the study. What else? So it was definitely not purposeful exclusion. It was definitely around what was our capacity and what was our level of access to these communities. I do think it's one very interesting point is even with those limitations, the level of trust or openness that we were able to gain from immigrants is something that we can discuss further in future and learn a lot from. This sort of insider-outsider perspective as a researcher. Yeah, something we can discuss for later. Remittances, no, definitely. I mean, if it did come up, it didn't come up strongly enough to kind of see it as a theme. But yeah, there was some kind of sense that there were some participants who started their businesses in their country of origin, not many, and then, kind of saw opportunities here. And who continued to, when they did go back to their home country, kind of this idea that trade was happening, across and in between different countries. So I did see a little bit of that. I'm trying to think of something else. I mean, there were some stories of like going back regularly to your hometown, to your home country, to update your papers or things like that, and using that as an opportunity to trade as well. But yeah, we didn't zone in. I wouldn't say the focus of the study was like particularly zoning in on those migration stories. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Just to chip in, thanks, since you've captured it, and Lauren as well. As researchers, when we embark on such studies, we are aware of the limitations that come with the nature of the study. Particularly, this one here, it was a qualitative, comparative, exploratory research design that we adopted. So we do understand that we could not have reached out to all of the categories in sufficient detail. As some people would have wanted, unfortunately. I will also make mention of the fact that in terms of translocal economic processes, Prof. Landau, there was something quite fascinating, and being an immigrant myself, I'm very well aware of an interest that people have when they have successful businesses or they earn an income. It's a desire to build home. So since you will remember that one of the Malawian participants indicated that he was in the process of building a house at home and almost near completion based on the amount of money he was making here in South Africa. Again, as an indication of how successful his business was. He also mentioned that he had been able to buy a small piece of property here in South Africa. So those are some of the, that's one of the unique international kind of money relationship that some of the migrants had with back home. And yes, let's take the next round of questions. We have Kanya. Kanya, you have the right to talk.
Thank you so much, colleagues. Very insightful and interesting. I have two questions. The first question is, did you find any significant differences in motivations between female entrepreneurs and the male ones? And the second is, were there any gender-specific challenges faced by the micro entrepreneurs? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you have any more hands?
There are
Mohammed?
also questions in the Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. Let me just quickly see if I can get to the Q&A. So I'll read them aloud. Okay. I see Prof. Lauren typed up this. So the question is, how do immigrant micro enterprises contribute to the economy? That's anonymous. Then the second one is, how has the challenges that were raised, I think, by Senzi, particularly being targeted by police and corruption, further inhibit social cohesion, and how can local police structures be used to rebuild and foster good working relationship between police and government institutions? I think we can take those for now.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think also in the previous round, there was a question targeted at Wendy, so she might need to come in as well. And there is also one for Wendy in the chat of how do we access the intervention program that she referred to. Okay. Yeah, on the gender question. So again, because the comparisons, there's so many different ways you can cut this, right? Do we compare successful, sustainable versus struggling, immigrant versus local, male versus female, different kinds of different immigrants based on their country of origin. And so we didn't specifically do a gender comparison at all. As Senzi showed in the initial slides on the participant demographics, we do see that there are more women that are in the struggling group and more men in the sustainable group, and that confirms research done in many different places that women are more likely to be struggling in their businesses. The purpose of the study wasn't to probe into those gender aspects, so we didn't zone in on that. Senzi may have some insights from the data that can speak to that, but that certainly wasn't a goal of this research, unfortunately. And then just to answer the how do immigrant micro entrepreneurs contribute to the economy, I mean, it was quite remarkable to see how all of the entrepreneurs contribute to the economy, but I think it really is an important point to make, given the negative discourse around immigrant entrepreneurs, is that immigrant entrepreneurs do certainly make a contribution to the economy in terms of employment, in terms of being last mile providers, in terms of generating income, coming into township economies, etc. And I think those have been very well documented in other studies that have zoned in specifically on immigrant entrepreneurs, whereas ours was very much a comparative piece of work. And then the challenges around the policing, I would say that you're not going to be able to deal with the challenges at the local level, particularly around bylaws, because at the end of the day, when police are harshly policing bylaws, those bylaws exist. They are mandated to police based on what those bylaws are. And yes, there might be some confusion, as one of the quotes that was shared in the presentation, one day you're allowed to trade on this corner and another day you're allowed to trade on that corner. And yes, there is complexity in it, but essentially the bylaws themselves are the problem. And so you have to be able to harmonize the discourse around supporting small business development and informal sector entrepreneurship by making those bylaws more or less stringent. As one of the key informants pointed out, transgressing these bylaws is a criminal offense. It's not just that you get a fine, it's a criminal offense. And so relaxing what some of those consequences are of transgressing bylaws, really thinking about what those bylaws are and how those bylaws can be developed in a way that is supportive for informal sector trade. I know Prof. Landau was one of the key informants that also talked about how housing policy is restrictive to promoting informal sector trade, etc. And so there's a need to harmonize that across. And then once that's done, to be able to drive awareness amongst your local level, or what we call street bureaucrats, the people who are actually policing the laws or giving life to the laws at the local level. There's a strong need then to create that culture of recognizing the value of informal sector trade, and how our policies should be supporting that rather than constraining it. Thank you.
Just to add to that, Lauren, I mean, we can only really speculate. Anthony has shared those statistics around gender, around the sex distribution. Women being more likely to operate as survivalists. We can speculate around, having care responsibilities. We can speculate around possibly being breadwinners in their families as well. So there were some entrepreneurs, some female entrepreneurs who mentioned experiencing life shocks such as the loss of a husband and having to then become a breadwinner. But what's interesting, I kind of have to draw on a previous study that we conducted looking at the local economic effects of the social relief of distress grant on informal traders. When we did ask them about their challenges, constraints, kind of looking for these differences, and explicitly asking them whether they identified these differences. And for the most part, they felt that being a business owner, kind of the experience is quite similar for the most part. I do think when we look at crime and safety, that might play a role. Possibly also the costs maybe of maybe needing assistance that might be increased for females, but it's all speculative. It's all speculative at this point. And then something else that was quite interesting that came up, it's not something that can be generalized. I mean, I think that's also the thing about qualitative research. It's very nuanced and kind of specific to your sample and to different communities. But there was this perception amongst locals that immigrants, especially in the spaza shop sector, were more trusting in the community and, were more open to providing loans and providing items on credit and the like. This came up more in Marikana, where the kind of cultural beliefs, and I think lack of trust in the community for locals was something that was quite prevalent. And they did see this as something that, I mean, one, it contributes to the local township economy if you are, as a business owner, able to absorb shocks in the economy, if you are able to provide necessities to your community at lower prices or on loan or on credit. So those are, some of the different ways. This is not to say that none of the locals were doing this as well, but there is this perception that locals are less trusting and will only give credit to customers that they're very familiar with, whereas immigrants seemed more open and trusting. But again, it's not something we can generalize. Over to you, Anthony. I do see some comments coming through.
Wendy?
Thanks. I'll just be very quick because I'm conscious of time, and I know we all have busy days. So very quickly on three things. So first of all, there was a question about where to find more information on the program that I had mentioned. I put a link in the chat that takes you to a website. It's a World Bank website that has a lot of different links within it in order to take you to examples of that kind of program. Secondly, I just wanted to call out what Abdelkader mentioned about the big retailers. That was something that really struck me in South Africa, how townships are just circled by these shopping malls that are very expensive, and I just haven't seen that in other countries. It's almost like vultures, surrounding the townships. So, but I think that that's something that is worth a lot more thought in the South Africa context in particular, is why the big retailers and what is happening that the big retailers have so much of the business of these very large township communities rather than locals being the engine of the business sector. So thanks for pointing that out, and I just think it's such an important topic that we need to understand a little bit better in South Africa. And the last point I just wanted to make is just an invitation to all of us to reflect on the policy recommendation that Lauren shared about this requirement to register, and registration for what. And I think that I've seen for policymakers around the world, there's a lot of this focus on people have to register. And the message that I and many colleagues at the World Bank are bringing is, for the micro enterprises, rather than they have to register, why don't we think about how to support them to increase their productivity? Registration, we're finding, is almost like a factor of production. It's an input. You buy the machine when you need it. You hire the worker when you need it. You register when you need it. And so that's a perspective. I know we have several colleagues from the government of South Africa online, and so I'm sure they have views as well. But I just wanted to throw out there for discussion for us to kind of do a reflection on registration for what, and maybe to go back, 20 or 30 years when South Africa first wrote its legislation around micro entrepreneurship, and it was very flexible, and then very quickly it really kind of tightened. And is there space to move back to that more flexible thinking about this is a way for people to earn livelihoods, and how do we encourage that, and then we bring in the formalization or the registration where needed. So I wanted to just leave that as maybe something to think about as we go forward, all of us professionally. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Lauren, do you want to come in for a second? And then, for the sake of time, we've actually overrun by 16 minutes. I'm sure we have indulged you enough, and if there's more that we can talk about, we would be happy to share the report and we can continue the conversation. Lauren?
Yeah, it's a real pity that we don't have more time, and I always find that the comments and questions are slow initially, and then once people start asking, then they start coming in a flurry, and I've been following them on the chats and the Q&A in particular, and it becomes difficult to answer everything given the time, unfortunately. So what I would like to just end with is to say a huge thank you. I know that Anthony did mention many people at the beginning, and what wasn't mentioned, I think, was the authors of the report. And so we have mentioned, obviously, Senze was the project lead, Anthony himself did a lot of the research work. Ariana, I've mentioned. But we also had Tanusha Naidu, who is or was on the call as well, who did a lot of the literature review. And then there are a lot of, I know Anthony has acknowledged the admin team, but also just to say a huge thank you to Jade and Callan for their support and Anthony in organizing this webinar. Yeah, so I think I will end there since we're already well over time.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Lauren. From my side, just to round up regarding comments about immigrants contributing to the economy of South Africa. I will make mention of the fact that State SA colleagues here can confirm that it's difficult to count, if not near impossible to count undocumented immigrants. So we rest on looking at the contribution of the estimated number of immigrants. Statistics are there, and there's research that has been done. I'm happy for anyone with any questions around the contribution of immigrants to look at a report that I led writing on busting immigrant myths that we have in South Africa. It's important for anyone who just wants to get quick access to the facts and figures regarding immigrants and what myths exist. As we close off, I would like again to take an appreciation for everyone who's come through today. We've way overrun. This research was bottom-up, qualitative research where we spoke to immigrants. I do understand limitations that come with the methodology, and let's focus on what this is all about in terms of the actual research. Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.